My name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. Over the past several weeks, the coronavirus pandemic has had significant effects on political and civic life. That includes, but isn't limited to, directives issued by federal, state, and local governments to close schools and certain businesses, and also to practice certain social distancing measures. And this outbreak has also affected elections for all offices, from the presidency right on down to municipal officials. We've been tracking all of these effects at ballotpedia.org and through our various newsletters, such as the Daily Brew, but we wanted to summarize where things stand on so many of these issues today. So joining me in this briefing are Corey Eucalito, managing editor of our Marquee team, and Jarek Adams, a writer on that team, who have been the lead group in covering all of these effects so that they can kind of walk us through everything. So Corey and Jarek, thank you so much for me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. All right, we have so much material to get to, so let's dive right in. According to the World Health Organization, COVID-19, also known as coronavirus, was first discovered in an outbreak in Wuhan, China in December of 2019. And then the first confirmed case of coronavirus here in the United States was identified on January 21st, with the first confirmed coronavirus-related death in the United States on February 28th. President Donald Trump declared a national state of emergency under the Stafford Act on March 13th. So at Ballotpedia, we began tracking the state responses to the coronavirus as they related to election dates and election procedures, but our coverage has come to encompass so much more than that. And we're here to walk through all of that with you today. So let's start with elections, which is something that we really focus on here at Ballotpedia. So Jarek, what can you tell us about the changes that have taken place to election dates so far?
On March 13th, Louisiana became the first state to announce the postponement of a state level election in response to COVID-19. Since then, we've seen a total of 20 states and one territory that have postponed upcoming state level elections. In one state, Ohio, the election originally scheduled for March has been postponed to April. In 13 states, spring elections have been postponed to June. That includes Delaware, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Massachusetts, Mississippi, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Virginia, and West Virginia. In 5 states, spring and early summer elections have been postponed to July. That includes Alabama, Louisiana, Maine, New Jersey, and Texas. In one state, Connecticut, we've seen an election postponed to August. That marks the latest postponement thus far. And Puerto Rico, meanwhile, has postponed its presidential preference primary for the Democrats indefinitely.
Wow, that's a lot of states. And in addition to those changes to election dates, the outbreak has also affected absentee or mail-in voting. I understand that several states have made some changes in this area as well.
Yes, absolutely. So far, we've seen at least 22 states that have modified their absentee and mail-in voting procedures. Generally, these modifications fall into 4 broad categories. In the first of these, we've identified 6 states, California, Idaho, Maryland, Montana, Nevada, and New Jersey, that have decided to transmit mail-in ballots automatically to all eligible voters in advance of select upcoming elections in those states. This is in a bid to ensure that most voting, if not all voting, takes place by mail. We've identified another 7 states, Georgia, Iowa, Michigan, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and West Virginia, as well as Washington, D.C., that have opted to send mail-in ballot applications automatically to all of their voters in advance of some of their upcoming elections. In another 7 states, Delaware, Indiana, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Texas, and Virginia, state officials have expanded absentee voting eligibility. In another 2 states, Ohio and Wisconsin, they've extended absentee and mail-in ballot request or submission deadlines for select upcoming elections.
All right, and Jarek, in those states, we have kind of like an interesting difference in categories. So some of them are sending mail-in voting materials to voters automatically. That is, some are sending actual ballots, but others are sending applications for those ballots. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And that's a somewhat subtle distinction, but it is the key distinction. In states where officials are sending ballots automatically, all the voter has to do then is complete the ballot and send it in, and they've cast their vote. In states where officials are sending ballot applications, the voter has to fill in that application and submit it before receiving a ballot.
Got it. Got it. That's a very important distinction. All right. One election policy area that maybe is a little less prominent than postponements or changes to absentee voting, but obviously this is no less important to people who are running for office, and that is changes to candidate filing procedures. Have we seen any changes in that area?
We have. In fact, we've seen increased activity in this area over the course of the past couple of weeks. To date, we've tracked at least 12 states that have modified their candidate filing procedures for some upcoming elections. In 7 of those states, Georgia, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, Texas, and Virginia, candidate filing deadlines have been extended, at least for some candidates. In another 6 states, Florida, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, Utah, and Vermont, candidates have been authorized to collect petition signatures or submit other filing paperwork electronically.
All right, that's really, really interesting information. Great to know. And then we often think about elections from the standpoint of candidates, as we were just talking about. But there's another aspect of this outbreak, this pandemic, that we've been keeping our eye on, and it's the effect on ballot measures that voters will see in November. There are 16 states that have either citizen initiative or veto referendum signature deadlines coming up in the next few months. What has been happening in those states, Corey?
Yeah, so we've tracked at least 20 initiative campaigns that have suspended or canceled their petition drives. 5 states have changed policies or procedures for ballot measures, and we've found at least 6 lawsuits by initiative sponsors over either signature deadlines and requirements or seeking the ability to collect signatures electronically, which no state currently allows. In some states, though, petition sheets can be downloaded, signed, and mailed back to sponsors. So although we don't know the extent of the effect the pandemic will have on 2020 ballot measures, it's clear that there will be fewer initiatives on ballots than there otherwise would have. Now, for some measures, that might mean a 2-year delay and some wasted money and effort. For example, New Approach Missouri was working on a marijuana legalization measure, but suspended its 2020 campaign and announced that it would be targeting 2022 instead. For redistricting proposals, though, the stakes are much higher. Arkansas Voters First was collecting signatures for an independent redistricting commission initiative designed to take effect for 2021 redistricting if it was approved by voters in 2020. But the campaign suspended signature gathering on March 19th. On April 22nd, they filed a lawsuit seeking relief from in-person signature, witness, and notary requirements. And Arkansas Voters First director Bonnie Miller said that since 2020 was the last chance to pass an initiative before 2021 redistricting, they would essentially have to wait a decade, not just 2 years, for initiative to have an effect.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of take for granted the interrelationship of all of these deadlines on the schedule. And certainly with redistricting, that's only going to happen once every 10 years. That's some really, really interesting impacts. All right. Twisting away from elections a little bit, there's another issue that is making headlines nationally, and that's stay-at-home orders. And these have had pretty significant effects on the day-to-day life for many folks. We've seen extensions of those. We've heard about protests. There's some states that have announced ends to those orders. So what can you tell our viewers about stay-at-home orders, Corey?
Yeah, we've been tracking these across all 50 states. And the names of the orders vary from state to state, but in general, they require the non-essential businesses in the state to close and require residents to stay home except for essential trips for supplies or maybe outdoor exercise. California had the first statewide stay-at-home order implemented on March 19th, and 42 other states have followed. So now, of the 43 states with stay-at-home orders, 8 do not have a specified end date. The others do have a specified end date. By political party, all of the 19 states with Democratic governors have statewide stay-at-home orders. 24 of the 31 states with Republican governors have a statewide stay-at-home order.
All right, so that's a great overview of the landscape of these. I know we had a story that just ran in the brew this week about some states that are either getting rid of their stay-at-home orders or they're gradually phasing them out. What can you tell us about the status of those?
Yeah, so folks have probably seen this in the news. Governors in 3 states, Colorado, Montana, and Tennessee, have recently announced that they would not extend their state's stay-at-home orders when they expire later this month. Colorado and Montana are scheduled to end on April 26th, Tennessee on April 30th. The governors of Colorado and Montana announced a phased approach to the reopening process once the stay-at-home order ends. In Tennessee, though, the governor says that the vast majority of businesses will be allowed to reopen when the order ends. Apart from those 3 states, the next states with stay-at-home orders scheduled to expire are Mississippi on April 27th, North Carolina on April 29th, and then 15 more states on April 30th. Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Louisiana, Maine, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. So with all of those set to expire in the next week or so, there will be a lot of activity in this area in coming days. Some other states have announced that they would reopen businesses in phases before stay-at-home orders expire. Georgia has been in the news, for example, where the stay-at-home order is supposed to expire on April 30th, but fitness and beauty services are opening first before that, followed by some movie theaters and restaurants, all without and before lifting that stay-at-home order. And then in South Carolina, where stay-at-home order was never given a specific end date. Governor Henry McMaster has allowed several types of non-essential retail businesses to reopen, like department stores, bookstores, and sporting goods stores. This is also an area where states are collaborating. There have been 3 groups of states that have announced that they would work together regionally to reopen their economies. In the Northeast, there's a 7-state working group that includes Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island. In the Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And then out west, California, Oregon, and Washington announced that they would work together too.
All right, thank you for all that information, Corey. Yeah, it's been really interesting to see these kind of regional affiliations happen, over the course of the past several weeks. So it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out. Now, there's another aspect of social distancing that some states have addressed, and those are orders or guidance that affect out-of-state travelers, essentially people coming into the state from other places. Corey, can you give us a brief summary of what's going on with those?
Yeah, we found those in at least 19 states, and these orders usually require individuals traveling from certain states into the state that issues the order to self-quarantine for a specific period of time. Though some do apply to individuals traveling from anywhere in the country. The majority of those orders were issued in March, and we haven't seen any new ones along those lines announced since April 15th.
Got it. You use terms like March and April. Seems like it was so long ago, but it's really only been a matter of weeks. All right, so the topics that you and Jarek have talked about are both specific types of executive orders, but those aren't the only ones. There have been lots of other directives that have been issued by the states that we're following here at Ballotpedia. Is that correct?
Yeah. We've seen that states have issued at least 1,262 executive orders in response to the coronavirus. There's a wide variety of topics, like you said, some we're already talking about, like stay-at-home orders or travel restrictions. As of yesterday, 7 states had issued 40 or more orders. Missouri and Wyoming had issued the fewest number with 11 each. The states that had issued 40 or more were Massachusetts, Michigan, Colorado, Arizona, California, Maryland, and Washington. By topic, the most executive orders, 188 of them, have dealt with businesses and employment. Behind that, 125 have dealt with licensing and 110 with public gatherings. On the lower end, the smallest number we've seen, there have been 2 executive orders dealing with the use of reusable bags.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Um, all right, that's all been a great summary of the actions that have happened with regard to the executive branch in all of the 50 states in response to this pandemic. But also at the state level, I imagine the legislatures are playing a role as well. So, Jared, can you tell us a little bit more about what how state legislatures are responding?
Yeah, absolutely. So as of yesterday, 584 bills that made some mention of COVID-19 had been introduced in state legislatures nationwide. Much of this legislation deals with appropriations for government responses. Other topics include election administration and the extension of emergency powers. If you take away ceremonial resolutions and bills that deal with the conduct of legislative business, 86 significant bills have been enacted into law. That represents about 15% of all bills introduced so far. It's also worth noting that at this point, there are over 20 state legislatures that have suspended their sessions in response to the pandemic. We expect additional legislative activity as states resume these sessions or convene regular and special sessions in response to the pandemic.
Yeah, and I know a lot of state legislatures meet in the early part of the year, so this has probably been a big, had some big effects to their schedule as well. Um, Now let's look at how the coronavirus outbreak is affecting the third branch of government, which would be the judicial branch. And so, Corey, have there been changes associated with the courts as a result of all this?
Yeah. So at the federal level, the United States Supreme Court delayed two of its already scheduled sittings, um, and it'll hear arguments remotely in May. Those remote arguments will be actually the first time that live audio of Supreme Court cases and arguments will be available to the public because electronics aren't normally allowed in the courtroom. So that'll be really interesting. Below the Supreme Court, the U.S. court system announced that all federal courts were moving to remote and virtual operations on April 8th. In state courts, every state's experienced some sort of change to their normal operation. In-person proceedings have been suspended statewide in 34 states. The other 16 states, court closures are up to local authorities. These court closures usually include suspending jury trials and in-person proceedings, restricting access to court buildings, granting extensions for deadlines, and using teleconferences instead of in-person hearings.
Yeah, those are definitely some unprecedented effects. I saw a story earlier, I think it was this week, that the Georgia Supreme Court met this week via video conference, and it was the first time in 175 years that they had met and conducted business without being in person. And I bet a similar dynamic is playing out in lots of other states as well. It will be interesting to look at all of the historical milestones that are going to be set during this whole period. There's one more effect on the judicial branch as well, and that are actions that have been taken regarding folks who are incarcerated. Corey, can you summarize what has been happening there?
Yeah, so some states are releasing incarcerated individuals to limit the impact of coronavirus in the prison system. 16 states have ordered the release of at least some prisoners at the state level, while another 15 have ordered the release at the local level. There have been 3 states, though, that have temporarily released certain populations of inmates until the coronavirus pandemic ends. So they'll have to return to finish their sentences after the pandemic passes.
All right, got it. Thanks, Corey. And then a final, or not a final, but another aspect of all of this policymaking is I've read about some lawsuits that have been filed in states against either governors or other officials because of various coronavirus related policies. Jared, can you briefly talk about those?
Definitely. So as of yesterday, we had tracked 36 lawsuits filed across 22 states that relate in some way to state actions or policies that have been implemented in response to COVID-19. While the majority of these have been filed in the district courts, the federal district courts, 2 have been filed with the U.S. Supreme Court. A number of these cases have been filed by plaintiffs represented by major advocacy groups such as the National Rifle Association and Planned Parenthood. The NRA suits have been targeting executive orders that have closed gun shops as non-essential businesses. Meanwhile, Planned Parenthood has targeted executive orders temporarily banning abortions by classifying them as elective procedures. And in some of these lawsuits, we're seeing state actors filing suit against other state actors. For example, earlier this week, the Wisconsin state legislature filed suit against two executives of the State Department of Health, alleging that they had exceeded their authority when they issued the emergency order that extended Wisconsin's stay-at-home order to May 26th. We may expect to see more suits like these moving forward, particularly in states operating under divided governments.
That's very, very interesting, and you're right. It will be very interesting to see how that develops. All right, we spent a lot of time so far in this webinar talking about state level issues and policies, but we should also talk about the policies that the federal government has instituted in response to this pandemic as well, right?
Yeah, so Dave, you mentioned at the start of the call that President Trump declared a state of emergency in March, and he reached agreements with both Canada and Mexico to close borders to non-essential traffic, and those restrictions are in place until May 20th, when the administration says that they'll be reassessed. The White House released guidelines for opening up America again on April 16th, which has a three-phase approach for state and local governments looking to reopen their economies. In terms of legislative action, Congress has passed three separate coronavirus relief packages. The third is the one that you've probably heard about. It includes the $1,200 individual relief payments that have started rolling out recently. And then earlier this week, the Senate passed a $484 billion aid package, increasing funding for small business loans, hospitals, and testing.
Yeah, that'll definitely be a story to keep an eye on for the rest of this week as well. So thank you for that. Okay, we've covered federal governments, state governments, how they're responding to this situation. And Corey, can you give us some insight into how local governments are addressing the outbreak?
Yeah, so we've had a page that I think is pretty cool on Ballotpedia, where we've had volunteers and our direct readers submitting stories about how their local governments have been responding. So there are tens of thousands of local governments responding to the pandemic, and we're trying to get those stories collected from the people who are following us and reading our coverage. So many local government offices and services have been limited or closed. Federal and state governments get the vast majority of media coverage, but again, there are tens of thousands of local governments taking individual actions. So I'll just share a few things that our readers have shared with us that show the actions being taken by local governments and things that are still really important to people. Asbury Park, New Jersey closed its boardwalk on April 1st. Cedar Rapids, Iowa suspended its transit service on March 25th. And Watertown, South Dakota closed its residential landfill services during the pandemic. So these things are happening at all levels of government, and it's been cool to see our readers and volunteers share those stories with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And as somebody who used to work on the municipal government group here at Ballotpedia, there's all these things that happen and all these responses and services that have to be looked at from the standpoint whenever you have a situation like that. All right, one last thing before we finish up here, and it's one of the things that I think has been discussed in the media, at least that I've seen, are comparisons between this current situation that we're in with this coronavirus pandemic and the 1918 flu epidemic. And so one of the really cool things that I know Ballotpedia has been doing is compiling articles and stories from 1918 related to the elections that were held during that pandemic. And that was a midterm election. It's an interesting look into that window of time and lets us see how people back then dealt with that scenario. So I know that Ballotpedia, we dig through the archives and we find news and add news stories daily. We hope you enjoy reading them if you get the chance. It's really, really fascinating. We hope you enjoy reading them as much as we've enjoyed uncovering them. So Corey, can you highlight a few examples of this that readers can learn about?
Yeah, so I'll share two. These are local newspaper stories from 1918. So, and they really do show similarities. This one from the Indianapolis Star, October 10th, 1918, about the women's suffrage movement. Everything conspires against women's suffrage, one local suffragist said Wednesday. Now it is the influenza which is trying to prevent a spread of suffrage doctrine, but obedient to the demands of the health authorities, the suffragists will refrain from public gatherings. So you can see public gatherings having to be put on hold for political activity and issues. And then the Oakland Tribune on November 2nd, 1918. This news story reads, voters are receiving assurances from the state and local health authorities that there is no danger of contracting the influenza by going to the polls on Tuesday. There is not the slightest danger in voting if you wear your mask. If you are staying at home, you are not being benefited by the fresh air and sunshine that you will enjoy performing your patriotic duty as an American citizen. Just a reminder that that's from 1918. I know there's been a lot of different discussion about the safety of in-person voting, and we've seen a lot of states responding to try and address that this year. But it's fascinating to see how folks were dealing with some of the exact same issues that we are today over 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And like I said, it's been really neat to see some of the similar areas where people were focusing on and similar sentiments being expressed in some of those articles. So I really invite you to take a look and to follow those. All right, we've covered a lot, and this has been an in-depth look at the policy responses to this pandemic that have occurred at all levels of government and are continuing to occur at all levels of government. And we've been covering them all here at Ballotpedia. So this has been a great summary and a great look at all that. So thank you so much, Corey and Jarek, for joining me today to talk about all this.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely, my pleasure.
All right, as we've noted, elections have been changed, but we are also still covering those as well. For example, just next week is the conclusion of voting in the special election in Maryland's 7th Congressional District, and as well as in Ohio's statewide primary, which got canceled or postponed back in March. So you can stay in the know about those elections and updates to all the news about politics and policy and the coronavirus pandemic, either by visiting our website at ballotpedia.org or by subscribing to all of our email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly newsletter, The Tap. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and thank you for watching.